That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Nobody's going to use this toy, we said. Who the heck cares? We'll go ahead and use it. We're using it for education.
Der Interplanetare Podcast. Die Erforschung des Weltraums für das Wohl der gesamten Menschheit. Eure Gastgeber in England und Deutschland, Matthew Russell und Sven Neuhaus.
Oh yeah, baby.
Twigs.
Bob Twiggs, Stanford University. Nobody's going to have heard of Bob Twiggs unless they're massively into Cubesats, I don't think. But we'll get on to Bob Twiggs in a bit. But before I do that, I am going to introduce Sven. Sven is one of the Spodcats.
Hello.
So Sven is my guest co-host for today's episode, or this week's episode, which is coming out on the new Monday launch date.
Thanks for having me.
Sven, whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm in Dortmund, in deep Germany. It's grey and rainy, like in London, probably.
No, it's actually bright and sunny where I am right now. But is there such a thing as shallow Germany, if Dortmund is deep Germany?
Yeah, maybe the coastal region. I don't know.
Thanks very much for doing this, Sven. So, Sven, you were badgering me to do more stuff on Cubesats and the like. Why?
Exactly.
What is about Cubesats that floats your boat?
I think Cubesats are a total revolution in satellite industry, as the same as maybe SpaceX did for the launch industry. They made it cheaper. Nowadays, it's just a fraction of the cost to launch your rockets. And CubeSats are the same thing for satellites. Now it's just a fraction of the cost to launch a satellite. Even universities or high school classes can do it. Even though they're much smaller, they can do what only the big satellites used to be able to do in a small form factor. It's a democratization of space, basically.
The democratization of space. New space, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning here that what I've accidentally done is lifted the lid on an enormous topic. So this might have to become a series of podcasts. Let's see how we get on with these notes. But before we start, I thought it's worth mentioning on this day, which is October the 26th, this comes out, back in 1968, we had the Soviet cosmonaut Georgy Beregovoy on Soyuz 3, who did a 4-day mission and became the earliest born human to ever go into orbit. So he kind of beats Yuri Gagarin's record, weirdly. So he's the first person ever born to go into orbit, which I think is quite cool because that'll never be beaten, right?
Yes, the time is running out. When was he born? 1921?
Yeah. I think it's going to be unlikely that someone over...
It's a rather safe record now.
It is a very, very safe record. Yeah, so he'll be having his centenary soon, won't he, of his birth. So yeah, you'd have to be extraordinary if you were going to be going into orbit. So yeah, I think that record is going to be safe. Yes, he's 3.
Congratulations, Georgy Timofeyevich.
Yeah, Timofeyevich.
It's the second name.
Yeah, so he's 3 months older than John Glenn. He's also pretty old when he went. In fact, John Glenn went in when he was really old in the space shuttle flight, of course, as well. So that flight, the Soyuz 3 one, was actually hot on the heels of the Apollo 7 mission, which was for 11 days. So you could see at that point that Russia is slipping behind the US in the old space race.
You think so? At that point already? They were doing like in-orbit...
in-orbit docking. Yeah, in-orbit. Yeah, but
they tried to.
They tried to, but they didn't quite do it. Yeah. So Apollo 7 did manage to do all sorts of maneuvers that I think must have been like mind-blown for the Russians. They definitely, at that point, the Americans look to be like steaming ahead. I wonder what the press was like at the time, though, around those Apollo 7,
1968. I wasn't even born then.
Yeah, no, neither was I. Neither was I. My brother was, though. It's amazing, isn't it? Kind of recent history. Anyway, I wanted to speak just before we get onto nanosats. I wanted to mention one space legend of the week because it is the centenary of her birth, and that is Sarah Lee Lippincott,
legend,
who is actually a legend. And It's one of those ones where I couldn't find an obituary, and the obituary seems to have found its way off the internet because it was on some sort of temporary web page. So you can see that it was there, but not there anymore. She worked on binary stars, and so she was a pioneer of what's known as astrometry, which is where you measure the movement of stars and their positions very, very accurately to try and determine more about them. And it's through that she wrote papers, one of the papers called Astrometric Analysis of Lalonde 21185, where it looked like she'd actually discovered exoplanets. So the stars were moving around, and they seemed to have a companion that was much smaller than the mass of a star. So, however, after a few years, that started to get discounted here and there. So it didn't look as though she did, but I think she got pretty, a reasonable amount of fame from that, as she worked with Peter van der Kamp and wrote his obituary as well. But I think she's mainly sort of this inspirational figure, and she had lots of students, one of them being Sandra Faber, who's a pretty legendary astronomer as well. So, yeah, Space Legend of the Week, Sarah Lee Lippincott.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
She was 99 years old last year.
Yeah.
When she died,
Yeah, so she only died last year. Yeah, she would have been 100 today. I think the weirdest part of her life is she married Dave Garroway, who was the founding host of the Today Show. Which that was her first husband. She also remarried Christian B. Zimmerman after Dave Garroway actually committed suicide. So she also set up laboratories to help depression at Pennsylvania University after his suicide. Which is so she obviously had a pretty sad moment in her life right there. But absolute space legend, Sarah Lee Lippincott. So Sven, after that sad but uplifting but sad story. Well, it's
let's talk about Cubesats.
Let's talk about Cubesats. So we do have an interview with a guy called Corey Shields that Sven you hooked up, and he works for SatNOGS.
Yeah, that's actually a non-profit organization. They provide ground stations for Cubesats.
SatNOGS is part of Libre Space, isn't it? They're really exciting, but let's not reveal too much about that, because then you needn't listen to the interview. But no, Corey was really wicked. How ace was the fact that he got up at like some ridiculous hour in the morning.
Poor guy.
I'd assumed he was European. Then it turned out he was American, and I was making him get up at like 4:00 in the morning or something absolutely ridiculous. But he was super, super cool. So yeah, that was definitely a really, really nice interview, and Sven was there as well. So what do you mean by a small satellite? I actually found a little table by a fellow German, Sven.
No, he's not German.
Isn't he? Gottfried Konechny.
Born in Czechoslovakia.
Oh, what? But he's at the University of Hanover.
Yeah, that's true.
How on earth did you know that he was a Czech?
Well, I looked it up.
Wow.
Because I didn't know how to pronounce his last name. And
oh, wow.
Konechny. The first name sounds German.
It's a good job one of us did research.
Apparently he's also a legend for photogrammetry. Yeah, he
defines it like this. This was from a paper that I saw about small sats, and so he's saying a large satellite is anything over 1,000 kilograms. So give me some examples, Sven.
Yeah, maybe big one, Hubble. 11 tons.
11 tons.
And the biggest one I could find was these American spy satellites, Keyhole. They're up to 20 tons.
Wow, 20 tons.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's a beast, isn't it?
They're probably the size of a bus or something.
Yeah, I mean, that is... I think the Keyhole satellites are similar size to Hubble, aren't they? They just must have a whole heap of more equipment on. Because I believe that the shuttle payload bay was designed for the Keyhole satellites.
Yeah, but they probably, when they are out in space, they unfold their radar antenna or whatever.
Yeah,
so the mirrors. Yeah.
Wow, 20 tons. That is ridiculous. Medium satellites, 500 to 1,000 kilograms. So
most of them nowadays, I think. they're going down in mass.
Yeah. Then mini satellites, 100 kilograms to 500 kilograms. And then micro satellites, 10 kilograms to 100 kilograms. So that's where...
Getting very popular now.
Yeah, so that's where some CubeSats lie, isn't it, in that?
Yeah, like Planet Labs, they have some optical telescopes.
Yes.
They're probably more than 10 kilos, right?
Yeah, I think what their SkySat is probably in that.
That's the bigger one, right?
That's the bigger one, yeah. And then microsatellites. So that microsatellites is kind of
the main CubeSat.
No, nano satellite is the main CubeSat.
Oh yeah,
up
to 10 kilos,
up to 10 kilograms. So nano satellite is kind of where we're in the CubeSat territory, isn't it? So you'd expect like a 1 cube to maybe even get into the pico satellite range, which is 0.1 kilograms to 1 kilogram, and then you've got the final category of femto satellites, not to be confused with femtosat, but femto satellites which are less than 100 grams.
Well, that's for now. Isn't that Project Breakthrough? They're planning to do 1 gram or 10 grams, right?
But I think we can call the Breakthrough Starshot ones femto satellites. They must be in that kind of range, because we'll get onto the Sprite in a bit, but so Sputnik 1957 not only was the first satellite, it was the first micro satellite, because it was 83 kilograms, so pretty heavy. And it actually had 2 of the common features. It had a comms device, so it was able to put out a signal, and it had a power supply. Yeah,
it lasted a few days, right? No solar panels.
No solar panels, so just completely off pretty rubbish batteries.
Broadcasting, not receiving, I think.
Yeah,
just a Morse code signal, right?
But within those few days that it was up, it inspired GPS. So people realised that you could, using the Doppler shift of the radio signal coming off Sputnik, you could ascertain position and things like that. So it was just that having something up there doing it inspired lots of... Well, I mean, let's face it, Sputnik is historically so important. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, it also freaked out the Americans.
Yeah, I don't think the Russians realised how much it was going to freak everyone out.
Yeah.
One of the most important things in history, perhaps, even when it comes down to things like table design. I've got a table that clearly is based on Sputnik.
Really?
it's got those
designer table.
Yeah, it was just that sort of late 50s sort of.
Okay.
I don't know. There's something about Sputnik seemed to inspire lots of things.
Just the question: at what height does a state end state territory? Because it's flying overhead all of the foreign countries, and the spy plane isn't allowed to do that. But a satellite, it's just so high that it's no longer part of the space of what belongs to a state.
Yeah.
So they established a precedent there. And then the other countries probably thought, if the Russians can launch a satellite that flies over our country, we can launch one that flies over Russia.
The Outer Space Treaty, I suppose, is all inspired by all of those things. But let's not get off topic. Oh gosh.
Okay.
So here's a question, Sven. Why have miniaturization at all? What's the big deal?
The number one reason must be cost savings. Cheaper to build, cheaper to launch. Also, just because you can, all the technology that was required to stick into a satellite was so big and so heavy, you couldn't do it in a CubeSat form factor. And nowadays you can. I mean, you can buy a Raspberry Pi and put it in a CubeSat, right?
Yeah,
didn't have that 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I've been watching a YouTube channel called RG Sat. And he's trying to build a CubeSat for less than $1,000. So that, when you think that there's satellites up there that cost billions, like literally billions of dollars, and you think, I suppose if you take something like, even if you took the James Webb telescope and you thought, well, is there a chance that you could build something that could do a similar job but didn't cost $15 billion?
Yeah.
And it's like, so clearly miniaturization. I like that. There's some really good things as well. Like obviously you can mass produce smaller objects quicker. They're not as complicated. They're easy to build into a constellation. So the great thing about constellations is that you can cover larger areas very, very quickly. So if you've got one big Earth observation satellite, obviously it has to travel round at orbital speed, and so can only take pictures of certain areas at certain times. Whereas if you have a constellation, like the Dove satellites, the Dove Cubesats
from Planet Labs,
once they've got over 100 in orbit, which I think they have now, they can do the whole world's surface imaging every day.
Yeah.
It's like that, which is
3.7 meters resolution.
Yeah,
or something.
it's incredible. I mean, that's amazing. Isn't it? So you can get plus you can get multiple data points. So if you've got a constellation of small satellites, you can do multiple data points. You can have inspector satellites.
And I mean, with the reliability requirements, you used to have this $1 billion satellite, and you had to make it super redundant so it wouldn't ever fail. Nowadays, you just build 80 satellites maybe instead of one. And if one of them fails, it's no big deal.
Yeah, the distributed system thing is really important, isn't it? So you can commission your constellation in stages. You can fail gracefully. So it doesn't matter if some of them fail. It doesn't bring down the entire constellation. You can survive hostile attacks or just damage in general. So that sort of plays into this idea of fractionated, which I love this word, fractionated spacecraft. So these satellites where the functional capability of a big monolithic spacecraft is distributed across smaller CubeSats, and they just interact with each other wirelessly, and then you've essentially got this enormous satellite that's actually almost blown up, fractionated in space, and makes it a lot more resilient. So the military love these kind of things as well. Less to burn up in the atmosphere on re-entry. That's a great one.
On the other hand, having hundreds of them has a greater potential for space debris, right? And they're not as reliable. So they're pretty much, in my point of view, they're pretty much ideal for low Earth orbit. Because if they fail, you want them to burn up in a few years. If you would put them in a higher orbit, like 1,000 kilometers, they would stay around for decades.
For a very long time, yeah. So very low Earth orbit where they can get a bit of atmospheric drag and be brought back down is ideal. A little bit higher is a little bit stressful because obviously they don't have millions of pounds worth of propulsion systems with redundancy and all those kind of things to get them out of the way. But once you're out of orbit, yeah, exactly. But once you're out of orbit, so we'll get onto some of the really, really cool CubeSats that went out recently. But there's a list here of things that you ideally want on your small CubeSat.
Yeah,
comms, obviously. There's no point having something that you can't talk to up in space, right? So
we'll talk about that in the SatNOGS thing.
I mean, so this is where SatNOGS comes in. So to be able to talk to your satellite, that's one of the most expensive bits. Obviously, you want sensors, so you want your CubeSat to actually do something.
Actually, you can also have one without sensor, like a radio communication satellite for amateur radio, for example. No?
You're right. You don't necessarily need sensors. You could have an experiment on board that's just an experiment. Could be a biological experiment, for example, on board. But
then you need sensors to figure out how it went. Yeah. I mean, you could say Sputnik, didn't have sensors, but you could still do experiments with it.
Yeah, so the experiment is almost using its comms as the experiment, right?
Wasn't there this dummy payload that was just reflecting light for one of the...
Oh, that was... what's his face from... Electron. Yeah, the Electron launched some ridiculous...
But that was actually quite
artwork.
Big, I think.
Yeah, it was like an artwork thing. Yeah, okay. I wasn't happy about that. No, it's quite funny. That really divided my brain a little bit because I liked the idea, but I thought, hang on a second, we really shouldn't stick up things that... no one asked for it. No one asked for an artwork that interfered with the night sky.
I'm okay with it as long as it disappears after a year or so.
No, I mean, I'm not so angry that I'm going to punch Peter Beck in the face. I just thought maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I read when Elon Musk, launched his car into space. People were saying, he's polluting space, but.
Oh no, that's just
ridiculously large.
Yeah, that I think is ridiculous because that's like sticking that's like throwing a penny in the Atlantic Ocean.
It's more like a grain of
not
whatever.
even a penny. Yeah, I mean, and it is, the inspirational aspect of it, I think, is still pretty cool, and the fact that obviously the car was pretty close to Mars recently.
Yeah,
so
and it's pretty fast.
It's going pretty fast for a car. Yeah, it's got to be the fastest. Must be the fastest car ever, right?
Absolutely. And it's very, very power efficient.
So sensors, experiments, attitude control. So yes, attitude. My satellite's got a bad attitude. So attitude is literally the orientation of the satellite. So if you need to point it, you need to be able to get control of its attitude. So we'll get on to that.
There's different ways to do it. Yeah,
lots of really cool ways of doing it. Positioning. So you might want to raise and lower the orbit, or you might want to do a bit of station keeping as well. That's a really cool area. I
think you can also do a little bit of positioning just by orienting the solar sail. The solar panels, if you have one. You can increase your drag.
Yeah, I saw that doves do that, don't they? The Planet Labs doves, they get further apart, and by using their solar panels as a drag in the atmosphere, which I thought was really cool.
Didn't the Chinese also launch one recently where they did some experiments with a parachute thing for deorbiting?
Oh, right.
And after a certain point, they launched chute that has a large area to make it deorbit faster.
I saw that there was a satellite that had sort of like a wing to be able to that it could orientate to kind of move around, which I thought was pretty cool. Power control. So you need power, obviously, to power all your sensors and comms and all those kind of things. So that's
recharge your batteries.
So yeah, exactly. So that's normally batteries and solar. I don't think that anyone is doing any nuclear stuff or anything like that.
Not on a CubeSat.
No. So then you've got structure. So the structure actually we'll talk about, because that's actually pretty important, and actually probably the revolutionary part of all this. Computing power. So that's obviously things like the fact that you can use the computing power, like you said, from something like your mobile phone or something like that. It's that kind of chip that we're talking about.
Quite a few universities are using mobile phones.
Yeah. And then thermal management. So obviously the space is brutal.
That's probably the hardest.
Yeah. So you've got to go
because it's so small. Heats up so fast. On the other one, it cools so fast. So
So in shadow, you're going to be minus a few hundred degrees, and then in full sunlight, you're going to be up a few hundred degrees. So it's you've got to have an enormous temperature range that you can work in. And then of course there's launch protocols. So all the different things that you've got to have. So for example, your CubeSat has to be able to have a mechanism for actually connecting the battery on launch, because you can't have your CubeSat operational before the moment of launch. So there's those things as well. So here's some Nano Sat facts. So far there's been 1,417 nanosats launched, 1,302 CubeSats, 2 interplanetary CubeSats, which I think is super cool.
Very cool.
And 93 nanosats have been destroyed on launch, so have been involved in things like CRS-7, I think it was, the SpaceX one that blew up, and the Cygnus one that blew up, and things like that. So
rest in pieces.
Yes, well, some of them were recovered as well. Like loads of the doves in that Cygnus explosion were sort of found on the beach and are on display in places. And like look in pretty good condition. Obviously they can't fly now, but yeah, so they sort of found them all scattered all over the place. So they're quite robust. Most nanosats on a rocket, 103. So I guess that must be the
insane the Indian launch.
The Indian launch, the PSLV launched those. 68 countries have launched nanosats. It's not bad, is it? And so yes,
it would be interesting to know how many countries have launched larger satellites. Yeah,
well, it's not many, is it? It's not many.
No.
Not
obviously you have these TV satellites. Telecom must be quite a few, but this is obviously much easier and cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, it's the a lot of countries, it's their first satellite, isn't it, that has been launched is a nanosat of some description. Normally a CubeSat. So there's a whole bunch of them of countries that is their entrance into space. So yeah, I didn't realize the first 7 Cubesats were launched in 2003 on a Russian rocket. They're the first official Cubesats. So that is back to Bob Twiggs, whose quote was used earlier, and from Stanford University.
Stanford, yeah.
Yeah, they had a couple of Cubesats on that launch. One of them
so
worked,
he was
one of them didn't.
The co-inventors, basically, of the whole concept.
So who was the other one?
I don't know.
Professor Jordi Puig-Suari, which is a pretty cool name. Professor Jordi Puig-Suari of California Polytechnic. So the Cal Poly. Yeah, they defined the CubeSat back in 1999 and had a launch in 2003, only 4 years later. So that's pretty cool. And the whole idea was, to get universities involved and sort of come up with a system that works for education and things like that. Hence that quote at the beginning that it was, how do we get our own satellites in space? How do we make that even feasible? So I think the best place to start is structure out of that list, and the structure of the CubeSat
is where it gets its name.
Is really the kind of breakthrough moment for me. It's a bit like the sea container. The sea container was standardized across the entire world, which means that your ports and your ships and everything can all have this similar object, and it completely revolutionized distribution and shipping all around the world, made everything loads cheaper just because of the form factor. So you see something like a shipping container, you think how boring, but really it's kind of boringness that
it makes it super cheap.
But it's revolutionized the world. I mean, the world would be a completely different place without the sea container. And I think the CubeSat is a similar sort of thing, isn't it? It's a 10 by 10 by 10 cube, 10 centimeters, that is.
Yeah.
And you can stack them, so you can put them side by side, or you can stack them lengthways. It seems to be stacking them lengthways seems to be the most common.
Yeah, so 10 by 10 by 10 is 1 unit, and you can have 2 units, 3 units, 6 units is also quite popular. So I think 6 units usually looks 2 by 3.
Looks like looks more like a briefcase.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And a 3 unit would be like a loaf of bread size thing.
Yep. Yeah, obviously they need to have symmetrical shapes. So you couldn't have a 2 and a 1 look like an L-shaped thing, would not work. Yeah. So
you could do a Tetris CubeSat.
Tetris cube. Yeah. So you can't have CubeSats in Tetris shapes other than
do formation flying and fit them into each other.
Oh yes, that brings a whole new element of fractionized.
That will be something for the Interplanetary podcast CubeSat, of course.
Oh yes, we could.
The first Tetris CubeSat.
The first game of Tetris in space using CubeSats. Oh,
excellent!
That is good, isn't it? And you can only fly the things if you're really good at Tetris.
3D Tetris.
3D Tetris. There are other formats for this stuff, and that's pocket cubes, which are 5 centimeters rather than 10 centimeter cubes. So that brings the form factor even further down. And then there's things like Tubesats, which instead of being,
I hadn't heard of those.
Yeah, the Tubesats. There have been some. 2016, there was one called the TubePod 3U CubeSat that launched CubeSats from within the CubeSat.
What?
Which actually I found isn't that, what's quite cool is that there are sort of payloads that launch CubeSats, but we'll get onto the payload delivery. But this is one of my favorite things out of all of this. But there's Sun cubes as well, which are 3 centimeter cubes, which means that you can have 27 Sun cubes in a 1U CubeSat.
Have those been launched already?
No, I don't think they have. I don't think that has been launched. So none have been launched yet.
I think they got the size just right for the first generation, definitely, because you have enough space to do something. I mean, you have to do all the things you mentioned earlier, but if they had started out with 3 by 3 by 3, would have been just space junk.
yeah.
But in 10 by 10 by 10, you can do reaction wheels and sensors and
well, that's it. I mean, I think, all these companies are working in that. You can buy off the shelf components, the COTS thing, and of course, once you set this sea container style size, then everyone's working to that. So I think the 10 by 10 by 10 is clearly the format of choice, and it means that the deployers are there and everything, all the sort of components are being built at that size. So the structure thing is like hyper important. There's only one type of sort of mini satellite, the femtosat, the Cubesat Sprite, which is a kind of cracker size 3.5 centimeter chip, essentially, with some whiskers that are its antenna. And they were actually, Cubesat 2 was launched by NASA on the SS John Young Cygnus spacecraft back in 2018. And that actually was a 3-unit CubeSat, and it had 2 1U units of it, contained all these little sprites.
How many were there?
Oh, over 100.
Wow.
So yeah, there was over 100 little tiny sprites launched from the Cygnus ISS resupply spacecraft. And actually there's a really good picture of 3U CubeSat gold-tinted box that's near the Canadarm as the Cygnus NG-10 is docking with the ISS.
So those were launched from the Japanese module, I guess? From the CubeSat launcher they have on the Japanese module?
No, I think they were launched from Cygnus itself.
Oh, okay.
Well, actually, we could quickly talk about deployment, because deployment's quite fun. There's lots of different type of deployment systems. I like the name of P-Pods. Mm-hmm. That's a good one. The Poly Pico Satellite Orbital Deployer. That can do all sorts of 1U, 1.5U, 2U, and 3U CubeSats, up to 3U. There's Nano Racks, of course, do CubeSat Deployer, the NRCSD, which is on the International Space Station. So I think that's the one that is used for things like the Doves, and it's brilliant. I love the film footage of that deploying CubeSats. I think is really, really cool.
Yeah, some Doves have also been launched from Falcon 9 from SpaceX.
I think the coolest deployment by far is a CubeSat called Chakski, a 1U CubeSat. Chakski is the messenger of the Inca Empire, and it's a Peruvian CubeSat that was launched by hand by the Russian cosmonaut Oleg Artemyev in 2014. He literally went on a spacewalk carrying the CubeSat and just threw it into space.
It's the VIP treatment.
It is. That is pretty cool, isn't it? So yeah, that is one way of deploying a CubeSat. So yeah, it can be deployed by the launch vehicle. It can be deployed by the ISS through things like Nano Racks, and like you said, the Japanese have got one as well. And there's Icy Pod. And
the light sail was also deployed in a cool way. It launched on the Falcon Heavy.
Yep.
But it was inside a university research satellite, 200 kilos or so, and it got ejected from the inside of the other satellite. University satellite, they wanted to do some local measuring in space of distances, and they needed some object to measure the distance from. And then the Planetary Society said, "Oh, we have this little satellite that you could take along," which was the light sail too.
It's so cool, isn't it? I mean, that deployment from another payload, another satellite, is super cool. I mean, that's so sci-fi.
Matryoshka.
Yeah, well, it's so sci-fi, isn't it? Having a sort of big satellite that can deploy little mini CubeSats.
Yeah, what we need is like a docking bay where it goes back into the bigger satellite.
Well, yeah, there's some,
but they usually unfold after they.
Well, there's some. Obviously, I don't know what the Russian one that there's a satellite up at the moment, which everyone's very worried about, which deploys a little mini satellite, and then the mini satellite goes and looks at American satellites, and then flies back to the mothership and can dock.
Yeah, but that's probably bigger than the CubeSat, isn't it?
I would. Yeah, I'd imagine so. But maybe the actual inspector satellite isn't. Maybe they have like a miniaturized CubeSat, but I don't know whether the Russian military are sticking to the CubeSat format at all.
Yeah. But they're really freaking out.
Yeah, it's pretty big. Attitude. So yeah,
that's a really cool topic, actually.
The attitude and propulsion, I think, is a podcast in itself.
Okay.
So we should do that as a second a second podcast. There's so many cool sensors now that we should dedicate some proper time to some of the stuff on that front. The sort of things that you can do. But before we play the interview, let's talk about comms and antennas.
I think the only thing they haven't managed so far is doing laser communications with the ground. Hopefully coming.
Yeah, I think the Germans have done it.
In the Cubesat?
Yeah. I think that there's a company called TSAT in Germany.
Uh-huh.
And they have built a laser comms that's actually strong enough to go from low Earth orbit to ground range. So it can actually communicate. Excellent. And obviously, it's got a pointing mechanism for this laser. So I don't know.
Can it also kill people on the ground?
I'm not sure it's that powerful. I mean, I suppose that's the good thing about a CubeSat. It's unlikely to get that kind of power, but
you just need a few thousand pointing at the same spot.
Yeah, no. Well, yeah. I mean, that would be. I mean, that. Yeah,
unstoppable.
Yeah, that would be unstoppable, wouldn't it? A massive a massive array of death ray CubeSats. But yeah, look at the TSAT in Germany. It has. I don't think it's flown yet, but they've certainly developed the part. It's really interesting. But yeah, normally
I think that's super cool because you don't have to share the bandwidth with anyone, and you get lots of data in a short time. That's probably the future.
Yeah, I noticed that sort of like the currently the sort of one of the most usual techniques is to use measuring tape as your antenna, which I couldn't quite believe. But yeah, and I was thinking, are they just measuring the satellites? And it's like, no, it's just measuring tape is just perfect for
they're also using it for the light sail to unfold the light sail. Yeah, it's just a motorized measuring tape.
Yeah, and it. No, some of them
see a video of it. I mean, it's a 3U CubeSat, and it contains a light sail which is 30 square meters. It's very thin and just very delicately folded up, and then it takes a few minutes to unfold. And it's just measuring tape.
Yeah, and obviously, if you can deploy your monopole dipole antenna as a measuring tape, I guess that makes it super cheap. And obviously,
cheap is good.
Obviously, the material and shape, I guess, is perfect for the deployment because that
once
shape,
it's deployed, there's no mechanical stress really, so it can be flimsy. Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And there's high gain antennas for CubeSats, which obviously need to be a lot more complicated. So you can see videos of some of these dishes, sort of spring-loaded dishes springing out of 1U and 2U CubeSats, which are absolutely incredible. But of course, they're hyper complicated. So that's kind of your NASA-style JPL CubeSat that have got these beautiful springing out high gain antennas.
The Marco satellites that flew to Mars, they also talk to Earth directly, right?
Yeah.
Must have had some kind of antenna.
Yeah, well, they were super important for the Mars InSight landing. They were there because they could get the information quicker back to ground mission control because they were able to pick up and transmit from the lander quicker than the big satellite that was orbiting.
Yeah. But it's mind-boggling to have such a small satellite be able to send a signal directly to Earth.
And not only that, not only did it have this antenna on there as well, it also had cameras and things like that. So the pictures of Earth as it was going away are actually really good, and the pictures of Mars are really good. In fact, they actually used some of the data from Marco to actually analyze the atmosphere. Okay. I know. So it's like,
crazy.
Yeah, I mean, but we're talking about Marco A and Marco B, or Eva and Wally, as they were sort of known as well. They are the first interplanetary CubeSats, which I think is perhaps the most exciting element of this. And there should be some more sort of deep space CubeSats going on the Artemis 1 mission. So when Artemis 1 launches, if and when, there'll be a bunch of CubeSats that end up around the moon doing useful moon stuff. which I think, that really is super exciting. So I'm kind of looking forward to that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there will be cheap rockets going to the moon, and then you have cheap satellites.
Cheap satellites, yeah.
Really cool.
Really, really cool. And so, yeah, on the whole, it seems to be X-band, Ka-band, VHF, UHF, S-band kind of comms that these things are using. But there was the guy that was building this under $1,000 CubeSat was using a modem so he could talk directly to Globalstar, Iridium, Inmarsat. So as long as your CubeSat is under the orbit of those, you can talk to them and get your message up to them, and then down to and
That's
relay it down.
Almost cheating.
It is almost cheating, isn't it? But apparently that's a cheaper way of doing it. So I thought that was really, really interesting as well. But
if you're not as smart and you need the ground station,
exactly.
Then maybe we have someone who can tell you something about it.
So if you've got all these CubeSats and they're all flying around, and obviously you need line of sight to pick up these very, very weak transmissions and to be able to talk to them. So this is where our next guest comes in.
Let's hear it.
Ekute.
The Interplanetary podcast, putting the ace back into space.
Welcome to the show, Corey.
Thank you.
Yeah, what are CubeSats? And then, yeah, you can sort of tell us how SatNOGS, which is, I guess, what we're going to really be talking about, fits in with that and how it all came about.
Yeah, so it's been, I'd say, well over a decade now. There was a design that was formed around a repeatable form factor for small satellites. And it was aptly named the Cubesat because originally this form factor was a 10 centimeter cube, and that 10 centimeter cube could be expanded into a 20 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter or 30 by 10 by 10, and then you could stack these CubeSats within a rectangular tube of sorts. For multiple deployment. So you could have, 3 CubeSats deployed from a rectangular cube at the same time, for instance. And this repeatable form factor and this repeatable launch and delivery mechanism really drove the cost of getting to space down considerably. And combined with the miniaturization of components and making components themselves cheaper and easier to source and test on the market. It led to just an explosion of new satellites going up on a very frequent basis. So a lot of these satellites, especially in research, where you have universities involved or researchers involved, there may be an experiment that goes up, and this satellite will often be using amateur radio frequencies, and those amateur radio frequencies, have a lot of restrictions around them, around non-commercial use and alignment with amateur radio principles and furthering science and technology, and as such, there's often a process of getting your satellite to space, and then you're going to see that satellite, you're going to see that CubeSat maybe a couple times a day as it passes by overhead. And when it's not passing by overhead, who's listening to all of that data? Who's collecting the data that's being downlinked as that satellite orbits? And that's been a problem to solve for ground station operators for quite some time. And that's where SatNOGS comes in. The original goal of the project was to improve the amount of data that's collected from all of these CubeSats and from these satellites that are operating in the amateur radio spectrum. And we do that through automation of the process itself and bringing the ability to collect that data in terms of cost further down, making it more feasible and more repeatable for ground station operators.
You mentioned different amateur frequencies. I'm not a radio amateur, so what frequencies are there, and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, so typically they're the two what we call frequency bands that are most popular with satellites today. There are other frequencies that are used, but you have VHF and UHF. VHF is pretty close to what someone might listen to on like an FM radio in their vehicle. 144 megahertz is the common point there. UHF is up higher, 435 megahertz around there, and the higher up you go, the more prominent are the communications mechanisms in spacecraft. But for the amateur radio frequencies, UHF is definitely the top for these satellites, with VHF lagging behind.
Is that all down to things like licensing? So you've got this kind of limited resource, haven't you, where you've got to keep people within very narrow bands because there's only so much radio frequency available. Is that right?
It is, and that's actually a challenge and a little bit of a problem that the Libre Space Foundation, which SatNOGS is a part of, is trying to improve and trying to contribute to. There are governing bodies, the International Telecommunication Union, which has an amateur radio arm, the International Amateur Radio Union, and there's a desire to coordinate these frequencies and coordinate the frequency usage, because it is a finite resource. As we go from single satellites to now talking about constellations of thousands of satellites, like this is a problem that has to be solved today before it becomes a problem we can't react to. There are governing bodies to coordinate those frequencies and try to approve and reject the usage of those frequencies based on principles and values. We're also finding that, unfortunately, sometimes satellites will still make it up to space without proper coordination, and that's a huge problem.
I was wondering, since not everyone is allowed to use these frequencies, do you have to have an amateur radio guy on your team if you launch a CubeSat, who's basically responsible for what it's doing? Or how does it work?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the idea. There needs to be an amateur radio station and call sign associated with the satellite that goes up. And the funny thing is, even among the amateur radio community, I don't think a lot of people realize just how many are in orbit today and they're using these frequencies. Because when amateur radio operators talk about satellites, they think of satellites that are going to relay their frequency and relay their transmission, kind of like a repeater in the sky. And there are hundreds more today, a few hundred satellites that are operational and just beaconing data, and they're not relaying data, they're not repeating a signal, they're just beaconing the data, they're beaconing the telemetry and the scientific payloads that are involved with these satellites, and that's where SatNOG steps in to automate that collection and processing.
What is SatNOGS, and how did it come about, and what's the kind of infrastructure behind it? Yeah,
so it's a funny little acronym, I guess, of sorts. It stands for the Satellite Network Open Ground Station, and this kicked off back in around 2014 with a NASA hackaday type event where a group from Athens, Greece, involved with the hackerspace in Greece, got together and decided to work on a project of automating this collection. And the whole project does so through the use of Raspberry Pi computers, a little small form factor PC, and a USB software-defined radio. most common is what is called the RTL SDR. And this is it started off as like a TV decoding stick that was really cheap. And 6-8 years ago, somebody was able to exploit that as just a general purpose software radio receiver. And that whole space has really exploded with all kinds of different uses. And the USB device itself is about $20. So together, Raspberry Pi and this little software receiver with whatever antenna system you can attach to it, that was the basis for the SatNOG setup. So from there, it's a matter of software and writing the code to be able to do the orbital tracking and to do the Doppler correction of the frequency as the object passes by in orbit, and then process those frames and upload them back to our websites.
Yeah. So what is the Doppler correction? Why would you have to do that? What's the lowdown on that one?
The best for those who are new to Doppler frequency and the Doppler shift, the best analogy here is a car driving by or a race car. The sound of a race car is going to be very, very high in pitch until it passes by your head, and you've got that effect. The same thing is going to happen in radio frequencies. As a satellite is overhead, it may take 12 to 15 minutes to go from horizon to horizon. But as fast as it's going overhead, that radio frequency is going to shift. So on the FM dial, for comparison, if you were listening to your FM frequency from a low orbit satellite, you may start off at 99 megahertz and then end up at 98.5 at the end of the pass. So to be able to decode data from a moving object like that, you have to constantly shift to be on frequency. And that's all done within code and recalculated every second on the Raspberry Pi.
Is the real problem with that, if they're continually changing, that they clash with other frequencies? Because you've got this very narrow band that you're working in already, and therefore does that band have to be bigger than you're actually using because you've got this shift in frequency either side of it because of the Doppler effect?
Yeah, as much as I let off with the finite resources of radio frequencies, there are some of these data streams are very small in bandwidth. Even if you go down to the original concept of Morse code, there are a lot of satellites that are still using Morse code, and that is the very smallest of bandwidth usage. So you can cram a lot of data streams within a single slice of that spectrum. But at the same time, you're right, there are collisions, and these often happen at launch within the first few days of a launch. If the launch is going to have multiple Cubesats, as is often the case, we've seen some launches upwards of 50 to 100 satellites in a single launch. Those satellites are going to drift apart from each other over time. And while they're close together, that identification can be tough of which satellite is exactly which if they're close to the same frequency. But they do tend to spread apart, and you can actually one of the artifacts that SatNOGs will produce is what's called a waterfall image, and this image is just a time spectrum based image of radio frequencies, and you could actually see the signal over the course of that 10-minute observation. So you can see in neighboring signals over that same course. And then within that, you can kind of start to see the difference between the Doppler shifts of the different objects as they're starting to spread apart over the course of many days.
So the ground station is always aware of which particular satellite it's paying attention to and estimating the Doppler shift for that particular satellite?
For that particular one, yes. So when you see neighboring satellites in the radio spectrum that are close by at the same physical space and the same frequency that's being downlinked, you can start to see them. And there are people in the community who are developing applications to better identify objects and better develop orbital parameters for objects that have just been launched based on the radio frequency observations. So if you start to see two objects drift in a specific way from a radio frequency perspective, knowing that they're both beaconing on a specific frequency, you can calculate their difference and you can start to calculate their orbit. And in that case, it becomes a game for a lot of space enthusiasts to be able to track these objects and to be the first to even beat NORAD in some cases in terms of identifying the objects in their orbits.
Oh well, yeah, that's really cool. I mean, what with the actual CubeSats themselves, what's been the kind of main applications, and how have SatNOGs helped with that? Have you been able to manage to expand what's actually possible with CubeSats, and what sort of things do CubeSats do?
Yeah, right now there are a lot of it's such a foundational phase right now in the development of space technologies, where the miniaturization of components has led to this form factor, which is now leading to what's next, what can be done next with this form factor, or what's the next smaller form factor even still. And so there are a lot of the experiments that go up that have to do with the flights themselves, be it the command and control, redundancy of systems, how do off-the-shelf electronic components behave in a hostile environment with solar radiation up in space versus very expensive radiation hardened components, and how can that be mitigated? There are scientific experiments that go up, usually a lot with university-based CubeSats. There may be a physics experiment measuring certain levels of radiation at certain altitudes. There are some experiments that are going up around the maneuverability of CubeSats. I mean, when you're talking 10 centimeters cube, there's not much room for propulsion systems, and yet at the same time there are even amateur groups that are working on ion engines and thrusters for a very small form factor that would fit in the palm of your hand. So I think there's a good split of technology demonstration and technology experimentation with traditional research-based satellites for universities that may be looking to discover a specific answer to a question based on the payload that's on these satellites. And deorbiting is another, and space junk is another big aspect of all of this, where some of the technology is being demonstrated and tested in terms of how do you act as a good neighbor up in space, and how are you going to deorbit a CubeSat when necessary, or before its natural decay has come. So there's a ton of stuff. Bill Nye and the LightSail project has been a CubeSat, and that concept of deploying a solar sail out of a small form factor is amazing. And that was another fun one where SatNOGs was right there listening to the data from the LightSail satellites.
Oh, cool. So they also use SatNOGs with the LightSail too? There
was a lot of press around the LightSail satellites. We weren't working directly with them on the project, but that's one of those cases where the satellite goes up. It's using the frequencies. We're all interested, and we're working to collect that data, whether or not the ground station operator or the satellite operator has worked directly with us. Although it's much nicer when they do, because we can sometimes tailor the software or make some tweaks specific for that satellite.
So are the satellites actually aware of whom they're talking to? Is it a one-way communication? And
in most cases, it is a one-way.
Do they broadcast continuously, or are they aware where the ground stations are located and only transmit at the right time?
A little bit of both, actually. In most cases, they're beaconing all of the time, and there are other ways of solving the problem of missing data as the satellite is not being listened to. So, for instance, whenever the beacons occur, it could be beaconing data for the past numerous hours and just repeating that process over and over. Or there are some satellites that are configured to only beacon over certain locations. So yeah, we see a little bit of all behaviors, but for the most part, the majority are just beaconing on a frequent basis. Be it every couple of minutes or every few seconds, even.
Yeah. So I think we need to take just a little bit of a step back, because I'm not quite sure we fully defined what SatNOGS is. So I'm gonna say what I think it is, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. But so SatNOGS, it's a kind of network of ground stations that could be built by universities or amateurs, or just like a man and his dog could have built a ground station and become part of that network. And SatNOGS is the coordination of all those different amateur and maybe semi-pro ground stations. Is that right? Is that roughly right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the human driver in all of this goes back years ago, where amateur radio frequencies started to be used more commonly for satellites, and especially by universities. And the process would often go, get your satellite together, get your ground station together at your university, launch the satellite, and when you only see it twice a day, you tweet for help. And you tweet to the amateur radio community because they're used to satellites. And so you would have 100 really enthusiastic amateurs around the world working to pick up data from these satellites. And traditionally, that process is very labor intensive, where you've got one application tracking the satellite with your antennas, you've got another application tracking the radio frequencies, you've got a third application decoding that data stream, and then you have to email it all to the operator. And that requires somebody sitting in a computer just for that 10-minute pass overhead. So the SatNOGS project is really just software to automate that entire thing. And it's all open source, open contributions. So now, instead of sitting in a computer and having to run 4 different applications to collect and send data from a satellite, it happens day and night automatically, 24 hours a day, running off of a Raspberry Pi.
If I wanted to get involved, could I build a ground station, and what would it take, and what would I need?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question, because the benefit of SatNOGS is that it's been designed to be modular, so that whatever a ground station can provide in terms of capabilities of receiving a signal, it'll work with the software that we've got. On the flip side of that, to answer a simple question of what do I need, it can range from a very simple setup with a very simple antenna that's sitting outside to pick up a strong satellite. And that's the gateway drug. You've got a Raspberry Pi, it's cheap. You've got an SDR stick that's cheap, and a very basic antenna outside. And you may be able to pick up signals from the space station, for instance, or some of the weather satellites that are up there. But you're not going to be very successful at picking up weak signals from very small powered CubeSats. But that's where you can build on that ground station and start to upgrade it over time. Replace the antenna with something a little bit more high gain or high power antenna, or go to a rotator setup where you're going to have antennas that are automatically pointing in the proper elevation and proper azimuth. Meanwhile, the Raspberry Pi and that little SDR stick stay the same. So we do have instructions on our wiki website, wiki.satnogs.org, on how to build a station. And that's where I really suggest people start off with, a basic antenna and a setup that we can pick up a few of these large satellites, get hooked on that success feeling, and then just upgrade over time.
So with normal astronomy, if you live in a big city, you always have the light pollution. Is there something? Can I build my own ground station when I'm in a big city?
That's a great question and a great connection to make. And I've never thought of it that way. Because in big cities, the light pollution is not a concern. And traditionally, even in the major cities, there's not too much of a problem with radio frequency interference within those frequencies. Our bigger problem in big cities is the horizon and how much obstacles beside a ground station, like a large building, may obstruct the horizon. And it's VHF frequencies and UHF frequencies are traditionally referred to as line of sight frequencies. And so it's not so much the light pollution, but that direct line of sight overhead is still necessary for picking up those signals. We've started to mitigate some of this in software. If somebody has a lot of obstructions overhead and their minimum horizon is 20 degrees, then that's all we're going to schedule for that ground station are passes that are going to be above 20 degrees. The next phase of that's going to be which corner of their visible horizon is the problem spot to block out.
So SatNOGS also coordinates all the ground stations, so not everyone does the same work?
Yes, there is. So there are a couple of main components to SatNOGS, and this one I refer to is at network.satnogs.org. And if you go there today, you can see that we've got a few hundred different ground stations that are online and operational at this very moment. And from within this satellite, there are ground station operators, there are satellite operators, and overall enthusiasts. And for satellites that need some kind of priority or that we want to focus on over a given period, they can be scheduled from this website. Ground station operators can schedule their own observations. They can go in and look for what they're interested in at a moment's notice. Or if things are sitting bored, we've got an auto scheduler that will look at a prioritized list of satellites and kind of reconcile what needs to be picked up at a given time.
So if I'm a CubeSat maker and I've made a CubeSat, how would I engage with SatNOGS to help me get my data?
Well, there are a couple of different ways. We try to work in the open as much as possible. I mean, this is an open source community. I'm a volunteer contributor. So the first place I would point people to is our forum site, and that is community.libre.space. And just announce the project there and announce what's going on. We do have some guides that we're starting to build for satellite builders themselves and satellite operators on our wiki site, wiki.satnogs.org. And there are some pointers there into when to engage with us, how to engage with us. We've had some great experiences with satellite operators who come to us when they're in the design phase and they're building some of these systems. And for a lot of the teams, especially universities, a university may work on satellites over the course of multiple years. And so those students are going to be working on this for the first time, and then they're going to leave. And if that university does it again, it's like doing it again for the first time. So there's a lot of opportunity to provide pointers. We've got many people in the community who've done this before, and especially around that radio frequency communication, being able to design your comm system in a way where you would be most successful getting the most amount of data from that satellite. So definitely, if anybody working on CubeSats listening in, like, reach out. We're happy to help.
Have you ever had anyone in a panic after they've launched going, please help us?
That's typically what happens.
So, have you got any good examples of that sort of how that works out?
It's funny, but honestly, that goes back to the initial. I don't know, that the big bang of this entire problem was that method of, oh, we've got a satellite up in space, and now we're not hearing it all the time. Well, what can we do? Well, we can ask for help. And so that does still happen today, even in the CubeSat community, where SatNOGS is not known to a satellite operator until after the launch, and then suddenly somebody points at all of the data that we're collecting for their satellite. And so there are definitely cases where we've been in touch with an operator after launch.
Oh, so you could already be collecting their data, and they don't even know that data's being collected.
Absolutely.
That's really cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Are there also commercial satellite operators that use SatNOGs?
Not for the SatNOGS network that we have today, with all of the volunteer contributors and volunteer ground stations. I hesitate with a couple of caveats there. There are some. We do allow weather satellites, so there are a lot of weather enthusiasts for collecting and decrypting, like NOAA satellites and satellite imagery. So that borderline commercial, but companies like Planet Labs, all of these other companies that are in the commercial space, for one, they're working outside of the amateur radio spectrum into more licensed frequencies and commercially licensed frequencies. And I don't want to say that SatNOGS would never be in that commercial space, but that's definitely not the goal and the driver today. We're focusing on the amateur radio spectrums.
Is there parts of the world where you wished you had more coverage on the ground?
Ooh, yeah. I would say almost anywhere in the middle of an ocean. And that's a little tough. But there are, if you go to network.satnogs.org, I think the main page is going to show a map, and you can see where all of our ground stations are today. So you can pick out the blind spots pretty quickly and easily here. And you can also see where we do have island ground stations. There's one in Hawaii and a couple of other islands off in the Atlantic. Obviously, Asian countries are a little sparse, as well as Africa. We've got a good station going in South Africa right now. And we've heard rumors of one in progress for Antarctica too. So anywhere there's a gap in our coverage, we're gonna use any ground station we can get.
So if you live in the middle of the ocean on a boat, you should help out and build yourself an antenna.
Maybe if you work on an oil platform or something.
Yeah.
So I have a related question. If I look at the map and there's lots of ground stations in in Europe already. Does it mean I can't really contribute, or does it make sense to put up a new ground station even if there's another one close by?
Yes, it always does. We have not hit the point of saturation for ground stations, and I say that because the growth in CubeSats today is just astounding. There are more going up into orbit every month. So at a given time, if you look overhead, there's a good chance that there are multiple satellites overhead downlinking data, and our observations and our software today are only going to focus on one at a time. So it's probably feasible in software to be able to watch a wider spectrum and use technology to decode multiple at the same time, but we're just not there yet. And until that point, more ground stations are always going to be better.
So who are the SatNOGS team? And other than just building ground stations, are there other kind of opportunities for people to get involved with the team themselves?
Yes, absolutely. So the core team was founded, and the overall foundation is called the Libre Space Foundation. This was founded in Athens, Greece, after that initial project kickoff. Back in 2014, that project was submitted for the Hackaday Prize, which happened to be, I believe, the first Hackaday Prize for their annual event, and the team won. So with that prize, they created the Libre Space Foundation, which is a non-for-profit organization focused on open source technologies in space, as well as furthering the mission of open access to space. So with that core team in Greece, there are contributors from all around the world, not only just the ground station contributors, but software contributors. We're always in need of Python developers, GNU Radio developers, anyone with fascination for space and software. We can definitely find some tasks there, as well as just overall satellite enthusiasts who want to help track some of these new launches and help identify some of these signals. There's some software and some work to be done there as well. We have constant need for just that connectivity and that connection with our users and our communities. So people who are good with documentation, Wiki is always in need of help, but that's a constant for any project. And our community forums are a good place to get involved as well.
So how many kind of people do you actually have that sort of help out with those things? Is it tens or hundreds or?
Yeah, on the core development team, it's definitely in the tens. And ground station wise, we have data contributions today from over 1,000 contributors. And that's both the SatNOGS network that you see on the map itself, as well as contributors who are using other applications and third-party applications, which we also support data from. We want to be interoperable with all sorts of data sources. So we have, I would say, close to 1,000 contributors just from the data perspective itself. There are a lot of people very active in the community forums, discussing new launches, discussing even getting into international policy about that core issue of resource consideration in the frequencies, and the up and coming issue of space junk.
Yeah.
What happens when the satellites are done and left over. So definitely a lot of contributors. The core contributors, as far as software goes, are definitely a few dozen, and we're looking for more.
Is there a core team that kind of drive policy and the direction that you want to go? So that that like a handful of people that sit there and have meetings and say we should be driving it in this direction, like a sort of a leadership team, I suppose?
Yeah, there is that, and that goes back to that foundation that was formed early on. That the Libre Space Foundation is led by a board of directors, and that board of directors meets regularly and frequently to help drive direction, and as well as some of those big policy discussions. So the most recent example of this was the development was what they call the Libre Space Manifesto, and this is a list of core principles by which the organization runs by, and in support of open access to space and good intentions in space.
Is that sort of cobbled together with sort of open source, in an open source kind of way, so that the community themselves feed back into the leadership?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that very manifesto was posted for comment and feedback, and as is often the intent for any major changes that are made. I think we've learned over the course of the years that any change that may seem to make sense or may seem sensible to one person may be culturally different on the other side of the globe to somebody else, and that's something that we've been working through and improving on over time. So trying to make this as open as possible and at the same time non-political.
yeah, which is really tricky to do, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah.
I noticed that the Libre Foundation recently joined IAC. What was the idea behind that?
Yeah, that's I was honestly I was just reading that myself last night. So
okay. Next question.
Yeah, there's honestly I as much as we're talking about SatNOGs here as well, I'll throw a pitch out for some of the other projects that this overall foundation is involved in. All aspects of space. It's not just that communications point, but Cubesats themselves. I mean, the design of a Cubesat is often either commercialized or something that a group will go into for the first time, not realizing that it can be a repeatable process. So creating open source technologies for those satellites that people can pick up and use and build on over time. That the Libre Space Foundation is very much in that physical space as well, trying to drive the cost down.
Where's it all going? Where are CubeSats going? What can you see the future of? And how does that relate to things like the cost of launch and all those elements? And are they going to go up on single small rockets, or are they going to be going up on these rideshare type?
Yes, all of the above. The recent missions to Mars, where there was a demonstration of CubeSats. Marco A, Marco B, exactly. A demonstration mission that followed the lander to Mars to test a relay of information back to Earth. I believe that was the first time where this form factor and this design and the idea of such a small satellite was in use outside of low Earth orbit, and so that's and that has since been repeated in missions to the moon, for instance, and that's going to be a much bigger thing as the Lunar Observatory mission kicks off. We're going to see that a lot more as well. So just the idea of miniaturization, cheaper missions, and you mentioned rideshare opportunities. That's really where a lot of this comes about. Very few, I can't think of any CubeSat that's been launched singularly into orbit yet. It's usually on some kind of rideshare, either with other CubeSats or with a much larger mission where the CubeSats are a secondary mission. And there are also a lot of CubeSats that get launched from the International Space Station itself. So they will go up as cargo and then launched out of the Kubo module, just pushed out.
So you mentioned CubeSats beyond low Earth orbit. Is this also something within the reach of amateurs to receive those signals?
Not in the case of Marco A and Marco B, the way that things are today. I hesitate there because I don't know that it was done for Marco A and Marco B. It's not going to be outside of our reach for sure. I mean, the amazing thing about amateurs and amateur radio is that you really can't say we can't do it. There will be a way. In fact, the lunar missions, I think, would be the next challenge for amateurs. But at the same time, we're also talking about a space where amateur radio operators have been communicating by bouncing signals off of the moon for a long time. So, receiving signals that are originating from the moon and are very low power is a challenge for sure. I'm not going to say it's going to be easy for someone just to throw an antenna outside. It's definitely more of a challenge, but it's not going to be impossible at all.
Well, yeah. The one thing that I was thinking of is there any opportunities for interferometry with like multiple ground stations, so that you're building a sort of larger dish based on the fact that you've got this a massive array of coordinated ground stations? Yes, yeah, definitely. And this all goes back to that flexibility in the software-defined radio stick and some of the software that's being written for that. And coordinating. We do have coordination between ground stations today, but coordinating those signals and using those coordinated signals for better results is definitely a future opportunity for us. Yes. There are a couple of YouTube videos. I'm going to botch this name, and I apologize. The Dwingaloo telescope, the radio telescope observatory, has been used as a SatNOG station itself by just taking a Raspberry Pi and a little RTL SDR and plugging that into the controls of BNC cable. This massive, what is it, a 20-meter dish, and turning it ever so slowly to catch the signal. So anything's possible. Wow, that's super cool. It really is. Look it up on YouTube. Just search for Dwingaloo SatNOGs, and you'll see it. It's fascinating. So how much data do these satellites transmit? Do I need a super fast internet connection to upload it all, or is it not so much? It's not so much today, and that's actually a big consideration for future technologies and future methods of processing some of this data. Because if you think of software-defined radio and how the signal is processed, there is that raw signal, that raw pipeline of signal, and we're not uploading all of that. It gets processed locally on the Raspberry Pi before it gets uploaded, and that shrinks the amount of data very considerably. But it also limits some of the opportunities. You can't go back to the raw data and look for what an anomaly was or reprocess that in some way. But yet at the same time, if we were to do that, that would cost a lot in storage, as well as be a burden on home internet connections. So we definitely want to be sure and keep that in mind for people who may be in a developing country, for example, or on a cellular connection with the uplink. So the data isn't the uplink isn't too bad. The typical observatory, maybe about 5 megabytes of data between the compressed audio and the artifacts. As far as the overall data collected, we've had, I think I looked up last night, 83 million data frames have been collected so far. On the SatNOGS network itself, through the automation software, we've had almost
probably days short of 3 million observations that have been collected.
Yeah, what's the most exciting project that you've been involved in? And I'm going to sneak one in as well. Is you mentioned earlier about naughty satellite people launching without getting any without getting clearance first. Are you able to call them out on it?
I'm taking note because these are two totally different directions.
Yes.
The most exciting thing I think is also one of the easiest observations that we can make in the network, and that would be anything related to the International Space Station. I think the most common thing that to draw here is that there's a program on the space station called ARIS, Amateur Radio on the ISS. And that program works to schedule contacts within schools, typically K-12 traditional primary age schools. And what they will do is they will arrange an amateur radio group who is experienced with working on satellites to show up there at the school or at a location where they can set up proper gear, and they'll set up the temporary antennas, set up the radios, have all of the school children there in a gymnasium, and have over the course of a 10 to 15 minute pass of the ISS, they will have a group of students ask questions of the astronauts, and then the astronauts will answer over radio. Now, from where SatNOGS is concerned, that to us that can just be another observation where we are collecting the downlink of that pass, but in this case, it's a downlink of astronauts talking to school children and answering questions, and you don't hear the uplink because that's not what the frequency that we're listening to, and oftentimes too far away. But you don't have to hear the question to understand what was being asked. So for somebody who's new to the project, and this event happens a couple times a month at least. So for somebody who's new to the project, to have a contact from astronauts and to have the astronaut's voice be picked up by a ground station that they built is just a pretty cool thing. And then to have that recording on the website to share with friends. That's pretty awesome.
That's really cool. Yeah,
that's super cool.
Yeah.
Do you also get the Chinese space station?
Yeah, we don't. I don't know. I'm not sure about their frequencies. I do not want that to be a lead into the other half of that question, because I really don't know much about their frequencies. But you did ask the naughty frequency question, and that's an ongoing topic. Like that's the hot topic of now, where what can be done if a regulating, well, I don't want to say regulating, but a body who is tasked with coordinating frequency use declines a frequency use, and then a satellite launches anyway. Who is going to be responsible for any kind of consequence for that, and what are the consequences? Like, once it's in orbit, if there's no kill switch, it's too late. So I think from a SatNOGS perspective, our stance is going to be to not incentivize that type of behavior by not really focusing on data that those satellites are downlinking. That's as well as from a policy perspective, trying to work with the governing bodies and say, hey, this is it's an annoyance today, but if you multiply it by constellations 10 years from now, it's going to be a huge problem.
Yeah. So essentially, if I was to launch my own CubeSat and I really hadn't bothered with coordinating my frequencies, I'd expect the cold shoulder from SatNOGS.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
As well as a few nasty tweets.
Yeah. Look at this idiot.
and I do want to be clear, like it's not we're very cautious about making it non-political. It's not about who launches it or why. It's whether or not that that frequency has been coordinated and has been vetted. Like that's, we don't want to be the decider of that. And in some cases, we do have to remind people this is not, it's not political. This is just, we want it to be open and accessible for everyone on Earth. And for that to happen, we at some point have to agree to share that spectrum.
Yeah, you have to make. I presume you have to make spectrum choices. I mean, this is that someone has to do it in terms of prioritizing what gets the spectrum and what doesn't. Yeah,
absolutely.
But but SatNOGS doesn't want to really get themselves embroiled in that political decision. No,
we don't. I'm sure we would love to. There are people who would definitely love to, I'm sure. But at the same time, that's what the International Telecommunication Union is set up for initially. And there are some radio frequencies that impact us globally. And if any one country were to try and monopolize said frequency, it would be useless for everyone. So that's why that governing body was organized.
SpaceX is now talking about space lasers. Is this optical communication also something you're looking into?
It's not something that we have been looking into from a SatNOGS perspective specifically. It's definitely something that I've heard interest in. The challenge there is going to be just that receiving point. And I know that I'm not sure. I haven't heard of SpaceX working on any kind of laser downlink, but I know that they've...
No, it's inter-satellite, right?
Inter-satellite, yeah exactly.
But there are some cool NASA projects where they do high bandwidth transmission to the ground.
Right. And most of our effort there has been looking at higher frequencies still. So the next challenge for us is S-band frequencies, 2 gigahertz type stuff. The higher you go, the more bandwidth you can make use of, and the more data you can downlink. But at the same time, the more difficult it's going to be to receive, to pick up. So yeah, there's actually a thread going on this weekend over some amateur radio satellites that do data relaying, and there's some effort to relay from the ground to a satellite to another satellite back to the ground, and these are 1,200 baud data packets. Like, we're not talking about something super high bandwidth or big. They're very brief bursts of very small data.
So where's the best place people can find out about SatNOGS and get involved?
Yeah, so the main webpage is satnogs.org. The Libre Space Foundation is at libre.space. Our forums page is community.libre.space. We have a very active community on the Matrix chat network. That's all linked to from the websites as well. Definitely jump in, say hi, get involved, troll through the docs, ask questions, and that's love to get more people involved.
We'll have to point out to the listeners that you've got up ridiculously early to do this.
No, it's a lot of fun. I love this stuff. It's great. And like I said, I'm a volunteer, and this is kind of my weekend thing. So here I am enjoying my weekend. It's great.
Well, thanks very much for telling us all about it. And Sven, thanks very much for pushing this one onto the podcast. It's been really fascinating. I'm going to have to do. I am so tempted to build my own antenna now, for sure.
Yeah, it was like a selfish thing for me because I also wanted to learn about this. So
yeah, definitely do it. Get a ground station up online, start receiving things, and before you know it, you're going to be you'll have a whole space station going up.
It's another hobby that starts off cheap and then ends up
like I said, you got that simple antenna and that first real observation. It's a gateway drug, and
I'll have a chasing a dome covering some motorized antennas.
Just having a cool tracked antenna pointing at the sky and suddenly moving must be very intriguing. What's it receiving right now?
I live off in the country in the Midwest here in the United States, and I get a lot of questions from my neighbors. Like they don't know what TV channels I'm able to pick up with this antenna, but they're sure it has something to do with the TV.
Right. Well. Thanks very much. I'll let you get off to get some more coffee.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Sven, for bringing this up. Thank you, Matt, for the time. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Corey.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
There we go. I really enjoyed that, Sven, and I still feel guilty about getting Corey up so early.
It was kind of early for me.
It was early for me. I'm not quite sure what I was thinking, but it seemed to be the time that we could do it. Right, so it kind of just leaves us to wrap this up. So yeah, we'll make this we'll do a part 2 of this. We'll do a part 2 where we'll talk about some of the payloads and some of the famous CubeSats and some of the propulsion and attitude control, because they're all so interesting. Yeah, well, we'll definitely talk about magnetorquers, reaction wheels, all the forms of thrusters that you can have. I mean, I went down the rabbit hole for about 2 hours looking at the different types of thrusters, and they're just like unbelievable. I'm so excited looking at like the kind of mini ion thrusters.
So what do you think about solar sailing?
Well, solar sailing.
I'd like to get the inside information why the current satellite can't raise its orbit and just fly away. I think the attitude control is not good enough. Seriously.
Sven, do you know the website you have to go to?
Indeed, I know. I've been there before. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So there's actually 2. One of them is www.interplanetary.org.uk. Mm-hmm. And the other one is patreon.com/interplanetary.
That is right. If you want to see the notes, I'll put some pretty pictures and I'll put loads of links. There are so many great links for this particular episode. So I'll put loads of links in the notes this week, and some pretty pictures. Things like Marco's picture of Mars is just extraordinary, and the picture of the Russian cosmonaut lobbing a CubeSat into space is pretty cool as well.
Yeah. I wonder if he stays around long enough, if it will come back and hit him on the back of his head. Doesn't orbital mechanics work like that?
I think it is something like that. If you threw it hard enough.
Yeah.
So
take a few days.
That's it. Thanks very much for joining me, Sven. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much.
I can't wait for part 2, because actually part 2 has probably got the exciting stuff like the sensors and all those kind of things. So, Sven,
even more exciting.
Well, it's just started to rain here now.
Oh,
it started sunny and now it's raining, so I've got to finish off doing some. I'm kind of doing a bit of DIY at the moment, so I've got to finish doing some of that stuff.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so everyone,
building your own satellite, probably.
Yeah. Oh well, I must admit, I'm trying to think of if we could do if you can build a CubeSat for under $1,000. This might actually be a project that's feasible for a interplanetary podcast.
Or maybe you do like a podcast, CubeSat from a few space-related podcasts together.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be a radio podcast and just broadcast latest episodes.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, a combined podcast CubeSat would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Oh Absolutely. My gosh, there we go.
It would be killer.
It would be killer. So yeah, I'm going to be working on that idea from now on. Right.
Okay, let's do it.
That's it. Bye, Space Podcats, including Sven.